Hi, this is Phoenix, and I'm going to talk about some of my thoughts about logic. I want to preface by saying that even though I'm going to be critiquing logic and criticizing logic to a degree, that I still think that logic can be a very useful tool, at least logic insofar as I understand it. I think it can be a very useful tool for our cognition and for thinking in general. And I just wanted to make that clear because I'm going to critique logic and the flaws that I see within logic itself. So I want to start off by first talking about two thinkers, two contrary thinkers, two juxtaposing thinkers, and that is Immanuel Kant, considered the father of the Enlightenment and the father of rationality, and Dostoyevsky, the Russian existentialist, who you can imagine has very differing claims than Immanuel Kant, and they definitely come from very differing traditions. So let's first talk about Kant. So Kant, in his book Introduction to Logic, describes how he says that everything in the universe operates according to some kind of law. And the trick is simply to uncover that law. So Immanuel Kant pretty much says that it is our duty to use logic to be able to deduce those laws. Now, obviously, definitely this is inspired by Immanuel Kant, by Isaac Newton and his laws of science, and that definitely must be taken into account. And so apparently Kant thinks that logic works much the same way, that if we can understand the basic order of the universe, then and by using logic, then we should be able to if we understand the laws that underlie the universe, then we essentially should be able to understand how the universe works by deducing those laws. Now, Dostoyevsky is much different in his thinking. He says that logic is simply a part of the complex spectrum of existence. He says that mostly humans are actually irrational beings, and they are not logical. He says that logic is learned, and his main problem is articulated very well in Notes from the Underground. And this problem is essentially the notion that he thinks, so it's basically a critique of Kant, a criticism of Kant's ideas, that logic can underlie much of our existence if we make the effort to understand it, because he says that logic is learned, and he would go even further to say that arithmetic and logic essentially don't tell the truth about human condition, and they don't reveal any truths about the human condition and how humanity actually works. Because essentially Dostoyevsky sees humanity as very, very irrational, and that is because logic is only a small part of how humans think. And so, of course, these are very differing ideas, and they're definitely going in very opposite poles. But I think that they're definitely worth bringing up because of their notions of logic and how they think about logic. So the question you might be wondering is, where do I fit in with this? Well, I definitely like to synthesize ideas with the Hegelian dialectic, as it's often called. I definitely like to think through opposing ideas and contrary ideas. And I love these complex ideas by Immanuel Kant and Dostoyevsky. I want to start by talking about an example more in line with Dostoyevsky. And so I'm going to do that by talking about a logical structure, a logical argument, at least as I understand it. So there are definitely many ways that you can map an argument. There are definitely many ways that you can map the flow of any given argument. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to say that for all intents and purposes, logic is defined, a logical argument is defined as having a premise, and a conclusion. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to set up a premise. I'm going to set up an argument, and the argument goes as follows. I see a motorcycle passing. That's the first premise. The second premise is that I hear and I see the motorcycle. I see a person riding the motorcycle, and I hear a very loud noise. And the conclusion is that a motorcycle just passed me. Now, this is how logic could potentially work, right? Because we have the premise, we have the premise and the premise, and then we infer some kind of conclusion. And the conclusion that has been inferred is that a motorcycle is passing us. And so this is the way that logic would generally work. But if I was going to go in terms of thinking about Dostoyevsky, what I would say is that this doesn't take into account other aspects of the argument, such as, or other aspects of this event, such as how that motorcycle makes us feel. So if I'm thinking irrationally, I might be irritated by the sound of the motorcycle. But think about it. How would you incorporate this notion into a formal syllogism, into a formal argument? Because essentially what I'm talking about is irrational. I'm saying that a motorcycle has irritated me, and that normally wouldn't fit well with the logical structure of any kind of argument, because it essentially doesn't carry any logical meaning. And so I think this is what Dostoyevsky is getting at. Now, to go back to his claim in terms of thinking about how, in terms of how arithmetic and logic tell us nothing about human nature, this is interesting because there's mathematicians that say that the only way that we can understand reality is by understanding math. And it seems that Dostoyevsky takes the opposite turn. But the thing is, I'm just trying to think about where I want to go with this. I think that there's something to be said about the unpredictability that is human nature, and that is definitely what Dostoyevsky is trying to uncover and understand. And he's trying to do this in this very, in this interesting way, by pointing out the irrationality that pervades our logic and pervades human nature. And so I have my own complaints against logic. I think that logic is an attempt to create order in the world where there may not be order. I also think that Dostoyevsky's claim about logic as being something that's learned is interesting, because it definitely brings into account this whole notion about how most people generally aren't logical. So, and this actually makes sense if you think about it. In day-to-day society, most people don't have the luxury of being able to go study philosophy and study complex syllogisms and study Wittgenstein. Most people have to just focus on making a living, on very basic things, and they're not able to contemplate and think through logical form. And so in that sense, logic definitely has to be learned. And so kind of what I get out of this is that it seems that not only is logic something that we use when we do use to try to understand how the world works, when it may necessarily not be a good reflection of how the world works, it definitely is indicative of this idea that, what am I trying to say? That we use logic to try to put order where there is no order. And I definitely want to drive that point home. because I think it's important. And so as a side note, when I'm thinking about logic in terms of something that's learned, this is interesting. Definitely, there's this really powerful passage in Marcus Aurelius's book, The Meditations, where he talks about how essentially we should have no time for syllogisms, and how the only thing that matters is behavior. And this is actually a really interesting claim because it describes how syllogisms and formal argumentation can actually be distracting from what really matters, such as behavior and such as virtue, such as living a good life. And that logic can indeed actually be a distraction. So I've definitely brought up these problems that I see with logic, ranging from the fact that some things that we experience don't fit in a nice logical form, as well as some of the other ideas that I brought up. Now I wanted to say that as I was making this video, the world definitely did not make sense around me. I was trying to impose a logical form on it, so trying to understand why my iPad suddenly quit on me and I couldn't record this video, or understanding why after that, and I was trying to record the video again, it started to rain and then I had to pause the video or stop the video. And so that's me trying to impose logic in what is otherwise pretty chaotic. There may be a logical explanation for why it's raining, but that, or why the iPad quit on me, but that doesn't necessarily explain the experience that I have. And that, I think, is a really one of Dostoyevsky's really powerful claims in terms of thinking about logic, how it says nothing about the complex world that we live in. We just assume that it does, and logic becomes this way of simply imputing some kind of meaning without necessarily telling us what is there. So Hegel makes an interesting claim that is close to this when he claims that science may tell us how things work, but it doesn't tell us why things work. And I think that it's certainly the same kind of question. So the final thing that I want to say is that, before I conclude, is this whole idea that I think that not only is logic an attempt to create order in the world where there is no order, I think that the problem with logic is that it, so how do I say this? Logic prevents us from thinking more freely, and logic would have to do that by definition, because the attempt of logic is to keep us rational and to keep us strictly formal, but I don't think that thought necessarily works that way. So again, to cite the example where people are not necessarily always in a strictly logical mindset because they're simply trying to survive or get their basic needs met or just get through the day, that is definitely an example to keep in mind. And generally it seems that the problem with learning logic is that by following the strict idea of the premises and the premises leading to the conclusions, it's definitely organizing our thoughts in a way that can be very limiting, and that doesn't allow us to fully explore where our cognition and our mind could lead us. And so that's just something to keep in mind. So again, to close, I would just say that even though I said that I was going to critique logic, I still think that logic is a useful tool for understanding how the world works. I just think that we have to be careful with seeing logic as the only way in which people should think, or at least logical thinking and logical argumentation is the only way that we should think, as well as being wary that logic itself can limit the amazing cognition of humans and the amazing cognition that humans have to offer, or the amazing thoughts that humans have to offer, and the fact that logic can actually restrict that in various ways. Again, this is Phoenix, and thank you.